Hey there, this is Josh Mia, CEO of MindsetMarket, and you're watching episode 3 of Authentic Practices. And today, keeping in line with the authentic message type of thinking that we've had, I'm going to talk to you about how to productize your service so that people can better understand how it is that you can help them. And we're going to actually go in detail as to why you might want to productize a service, what it even means to do so, and then the actual sequence you can go through in order to achieve what is actually a productized service. All right, so first, what does it mean to productize something? It sounds like a very jargony term, and to be honest, it is, but it's a term with significant value. So when you productize a service, what you're doing is you're trying to make a service a very clear, understandable, predictable thing. Now, I know that kind of sounds like the opposite of how therapy actually goes, right? I mean, you meet someone new and you really want to focus on their unique circumstances and really deliver an experience that's ultimately really helpful for moving them, from point A to point, frankly, wherever it is that they're, meant to be. But in this particular instance, what it means to productize your service is to try to figure out, what type of experience from a beginning transitional phase to end is someone likely to go through in their experience with you as a therapist. For example, let's say that your focus is really on mindset. And so you might find that your phase, sort of a 3-part step process, might be learning, practicing, and then becoming. Something along those lines, where in step 1, we really kind of learn about how you got to where you currently are in your life and your station. And then in part 2, we talk about different things to kind of practice, to maybe break out of old habits, just kind of stuff and ways to think about things. And then finally, we're becoming, where we're integrating ourselves into this person we really want it to be, and we're becoming used to that, right? So that's kind of a somewhat common stage process, and it may be different from person to person in terms of the actual nuances of it, but generally speaking, learning, practicing, and becoming is a somewhat, consistent experience people have when they actually go through therapy. And when you're able to say to someone on the phone, or perhaps on your website, or wherever it is people learn about you on an online directory, that most commonly I go through a 3-part process with my clients that first includes learning, acting, and then becoming. You provide some degree of predictability and some degree of clarity so that people can know, so this is what therapy is actually like, right? A lot of times, especially if you're familiar with authentic practices, you're going to hear me talk about things from the standpoint of a potential client. And that person is really not that familiar with therapy, right? Most people who see a therapist, or many I should say, they really are not that familiar with what they should actually come to expect. And we want to make it a lot easier for someone to commit to the process, right? Because it shouldn't be this scary thing to work with you as a counselor. It should feel, like a warm, helpful, just clarifying process. And the more you can productize your service by at least clarifying that, people go through a certain number of stages and this is kind of what they're like, it helps people to understand to some degree exactly how you can help them. But beyond that, it also helps them understand, what the actual therapeutic process is like. So we're going to go in, am I just going to talk about my mother the whole time, or, sort of the tropes people have about therapy? What types of questions are we going to ask about my sexuality, or who knows, whatever topics are going to come up? Well, actually, my practice has a 3-part process. And first, we go through this phase. You can describe how long it takes if you feel like there's actually a duration of time you want to commit to. Most commonly, people don't. But this is what phase 1 looks like. This is what phase 2 looks like. And this is what phase 3 looks like. And this is going to be really based on, your interaction with me as a counselor, or you can figure out what type of language you want to use. But fundamentally, this is going to help people access therapy a little more easily, and think about it. Like usually when someone buys something from almost anywhere, there's some degree of definition as to what they can expect, right? If you go to a grocery store, you buy cereal. If you buy Cheerios, you know what Cheerios looks like. If you were to open it up and find a flank steak, it would be bizarre, right? If you were to go try to get a service from your auto shop, and instead they were to offer you a dental cleaning, bizarre, right? There's a degree of predictability inherent to just any kind of commercial transaction. And I know it kind of is a stinker to think about therapy as a commercial transaction, but from the initial standpoint, we're trying to break down the barriers of people thinking about it in that way by helping them access what therapy is really about more easily. And that includes, offering them some understanding of the stages people go through in the therapeutic process with you. This doesn't mean that you can't have a unique practice that is dedicated in a different manner, in terms of its process to different clients. You can do that, but you still want to offer people some degree of expectation, that you want to give them something that says, first we're going to do this, and then commonly this happens, and then, here's some example of what success might look like. Now, one of the implications of doing this is that it's going to make your actual phone calls, which, me as a marketing consultant therapist, I'll tell you those are kind of sales calls. It's going to make them much more simple, frankly, because you're going to have a process to your actual sales call, a process to your actual, whether you want to call it an intake session, but it's not quite that, a discovery call, whatever you want to call it, introductory phone call. You're going to know, very straightforward, this is the progression of the phone call. So one common pattern to that phone call is, hi, I'm such and such, how can I help you? And the person talks about it, you ask a couple probing questions, and then, you build a little bit of a rapport. In the middle section, you describe what the actual process looks like, right? The productized version of your service. And then in the final stage, you sort of ask, would they like to come in for an initial session to see if we're a good fit? And this is sort of that chain in between discovery and, why don't you come in to visit, where you describe to them what this experience is like in a type of phrasing that they can digest and perhaps, think about a little bit further before they make the commitment. And the other nice thing about this is that when you're able to productize your service to some extent, it removes some of the barriers that come from that initial in-person session. So what happens very commonly when a therapist sees a new client? The client doesn't know exactly what to expect, and the therapist knows the relationship is important. And so is, the ongoing effort and work. So what happens if one person doesn't know what to expect and the other person knows that it's the relationship that's really important to a large extent? Well, you're gonna have a hard time meeting in the middle in that first session. And that's one of the reasons why it's a very common issue that lots of practitioners have, where you just have significant drop-off after that first session. And a lot of that has to do with a failure to clarify expectations in terms of the goals of therapy, the goals of a first session, and you're not really breaking down barriers enough when you're not clear enough about the actual conduct of your practice. You want someone to arrive and just feel as though, yeah, this is something that I expected. It's new for me, but I can see how this helps. And I can take this back to the process that was described to me, and it makes sense. Like, I can see how this initial first session fits into this first bucket of maybe we're learning, and how maybe that transitions into the second. And now you've got a nice foundation to your actual therapeutic journey. So productizing your service is a way, again, of clarifying through stages the actual experience of therapy, so that you can offer someone crystal clear knowledge, or at least some degree of clarifying information around what that experience is like. And that's going to make it so much easier for you to help them, and it's going to make them more receptive to the therapeutic experience. Assuming that all makes sense, and if it doesn't, leave a comment down below, as I'll mention again at the end of this video. You can also email me. But now I want to talk about the actual process that's involved with productizing your service. So what it's really about is asking yourself a few key questions that relate to the experience you're already providing. Most commonly, therapists do see a degree of pattern to their therapeutic process, right? So you might see that, session 1 kind of goes this way, session 2 kind of goes that way, and then maybe once you get to session 10 or so, if it goes that far or beyond, there's a certain pattern to how you relate to people. And, and sometimes, when you're a very empathetic person, I know I'm this way, you find yourself really changing depending on the person you're trying to relate to. But that's not for me to talk about. That's really just whatever your process is like. The overall point that I'm making, though, is that you have experience helping people, and there's some degree of pattern to it. So it's not just totally chaotic every time, right? And so all I'm asking you to do is to sort of ask yourself some key questions that are going to help you break down, step 1, step 2, step 3, or if you have, maybe it's a 4-step process or a 6-step process, whatever it is. 3 is kind of the magical number, just kind of speaking as a marketer. But 3-step process, people can easily remember it. When you sort of summarize your service, the therapeutic process in this way, It's really going to help people. So, okay. So let's talk about stage one. If we kind of stick with this, this 3-step process, just kind of humor me, right? You may have 5 steps when you're all done, but for here, we're going to talk about 3. All right, step 1. The question you ask yourself is, what does the beginning of the therapeutic journey look like? Right? When someone first sees you on that first session, what does the beginning of that journey look like? What are you really doing? Are you accomplishing things? Are you maybe learning things? Is it a discovery phase? Maybe it's a replenishing phase where this person can kind of just be who they are with you, just sort of, you just sit there, you're just happy to listen, take notes and pay attention to what they're about, give them that sort of open space they need to be themselves, or do you have a different type of process where maybe you're going to ask a series of straightforward questions to get background information, to really, from your own standpoint, kind of catalog some context about this person. What does the beginning of the therapeutic journey look like with you? You can figure out what the beginning looks like. It's going to give you immense clarity as to how to summarize the first part of the therapeutic process with you. So that there's some degree of expectation as to what's going to happen and what's going to happen next. And now we're going to talk about the second part of the actual 3-step process. The question you want to ask yourself is, what does the transitional experience look like for someone who's receiving therapy, right? And what does that look like within your practice? Is it maybe a time for someone to practice a new set of habits? Is it a time for them to reflect a little more on some of their previous decisions? Is it a time for them to just kind of take a break, and now you've gone through a certain learning and discovery phase, maybe it's time for everybody to just kind of relax and create some open space? Is it a time for meditation if that's the type of practice you have? Is it a time to review maybe someone's nutrition if you're into holistic therapy, right? What happens in that transitional phase? What does that look like? And, try to find some type of term that is a reasonable reflection of what that stage looks like. And keep in mind, you get to describe it, right? So a lot of times I get into sort of a conversation where a therapist says, I don't really know how to describe this exactly, right? Because, a lot of things happen here. And the answer is just pick the term that you think is the closest, even if it's not 100% optimal, and know that you'll be able to describe what that means a little more, whether it's on your website or in a phone call or in an online directory or what have you, but it's going to give you some type of anchor for the great middle, right? So we've got the beginning, we've got the end, and we have the great middle of the therapeutic process. Just think of some type of term that you think describes the middle transitional phase. And so again, ask yourself, what does the experience of the transitional phase of the therapeutic process look and feel like for a client of yours? And you can certainly reflect on, previous and existing clients to try to give yourself that type of visibility into what that term might be. So that's 2. And now here's the third question you're going to want to ask yourself. The third question you're going to want to ask yourself is, what does the end look like? The end, and to be honest with you, what's probably going to happen is there isn't really an end, right? I mean, life's a journey. Learning about ourselves is a journey. I know that there's lots of therapists who work with their clients for many, many years, and it's terrific, right? I mean, they have great relationships, and it's really a healing process, and it's a self-improvement process for that client. Terrific. But there should be some way to describe that last stage of the journey. And it could be a stage that kind of goes on forever, right? Maybe that stage is actually called growth. Where does growth stop? I mean, as long as you're in motion and you're learning and you're experiencing, we're growing, right? So the question to ask yourself is, what does that last stage of the therapeutic process look like? And you're welcome in your descriptions to kind of keep in mind that, maybe you go back and revisit the second stage sometimes, or the first stage. Life has its cycles. It's not definitively an endpoint, but it is a figure of speech in terms of, this is the last step in this process. At the very least, here's where we want to go. If before we were learning and in the second phase we were practicing, and the third phase we're becoming, when does becoming stop? It never really stops, because we're always looking to integrate more of what we learn. We're looking to improve. We're looking to get better. all these types of things. But again, you're asking yourself, what does that last phase of the therapeutic process look like? Or put differently, what is the goal of the therapeutic process, right? What is the goal of where you want someone to eventually find themselves? Are they more whole? Whatever they are, that's the question you ask yourself. What's the end of the process? What's the goal of the process? Whatever that anchor term is, provide a little description. Think about your success stories, right? And I know you can't guarantee outcomes for anybody, and you shouldn't, right? You really shouldn't. And I mean, legally you can't. But what you can do is say, this is the process people go through as clients that I've seen on a fairly frequent basis, and you can say to yourself, these are what my success stories tend to look like. This is what they tend to feel like, and so this is the term that I choose to use. I use becoming, or the third step is growth, or maybe the third step is action. Again, a lot of this depends on the nature of your practice and just literally the nature of your practice. But that's the question you ask yourself. What's the goal? What's the end? What's the last stage? And that's going to help someone have, in summary, a step 1, a step 2, and a step 3 part to what they can actually expect through the therapeutic journey. And one of the nicest things about this is, put yourself in your client's shoes for a second, which I know you do all the time, but I just mean kind of generically. So let's say that someone experiences, a divorce in their life, and which is a common reason why someone might want to seek additional counseling. Or certainly, a death in the family, or any number of traumas or personal relationship tragedies or what have you. They are thinking about eventually getting to the other side of whatever that situation is. They may not know what that looks like, but you do. And by having that last step in the process you can articulate, it's going to give someone some visibility into their own situation. It gives them more hope, right? It demonstrates, light at the end of the tunnel, and it gives them more optimism. And so that's why you're asking yourself, what is the goal of therapy? And in your practice, right? Not generically, but within your practice, how things go. And it may turn out, again, depending on the nature of your practice, it can be wildly different. If you're a holistic practitioner, you may literally call the last phase just health or something like that, because you've now achieved it, or something, or some approximation of that. So I hope that makes sense. And the reason you want to productize therapy is because you want to offer people some degree of clarity as to what they're going to experience, because that's going to just do so many great things for you and your potential client. It's going to help them understand why they're even starting and where they can hope to go. It's going to help you talk about what's actually happening in the great middle of that initial sales call, right? So, or that initial discovery call, if you will, where now you've asked some probing back and forth questions, you describe what your therapy process is like, and then you welcome them for a session. And the more clarity you can have, the more comfort you can achieve in that first session. It's going to make that first session so much more productive. And it's going to help you anchor a therapeutic relationship that could last, frankly, as long as it is fruitful for your client. So that's why you want to productize your therapy service. It doesn't mean that you're making it cookie cutter. It doesn't mean that you're essentializing, your therapy. What you're doing is you're saying that there is a certain type of experience, and this is what it's like, and now I welcome you. This is something that can help you, right? And that's how you help people, by offering them some degree of clarity, so they can take ownership over their situation. So if you have any questions about that, you can always follow up with me. Now, I want to raise a point that comes up very frequently in conversations with practitioners, and the question that I get is very straightforward. What if I offer multiple disciplines within my practice, right? I work with people who suffer through depression, through anxiety, through divorces, through deaths, through, PTSD, I provide child therapy as well, family therapy, I do all these different types of things. And I'll be honest with you, if you haven't niched your practice yet, and most therapists haven't, then productizing does become more of a challenge. It just is. There's to some degree you could still, provide a degree of kind of 3-step process clarity, sort of overarching on your therapy. So for example, if you're a holistic therapist that also tends to, work with individuals, couples, and families, you still may have an undergirding philosophy that you're able to extrapolate into something like a 3-part process. that is still relevant to each of those individual specializations. But frankly, if you are willing to niche, it's going to be easier for people to choose you, for starters. It'll be easier for you to be clear in how you help people because you'll have this actual pattern. Eventually, you'll develop something that's almost like a curriculum, even if you don't intend to. So if you niche, it gets a lot easier. So again, if you're generic, think about the philosophy undergirding your practice and extrapolate that into your sort of part 1, part 2, part 3. Now, let's say that you're in the other situation where you're highly specialized, but you actually offer multiple specializations. For example, it's not uncommon for someone to, let's say, do a lot with, let's say, anxiety, but also eating disorders, right? There may be some degree of relationship between sort of generalized anxiety and eating disorders, but they actually do offer a specialization in this area. Or there's, for example, folks who do a lot of work with same-sex couples, and that is a niche to some extent, but then they also offer couples therapy in general to other groups, regardless of the same-sex specialization. And in that instance, if you have multiple specialties, again, I'd ask you to think about sort of the philosophy kind of undergirding your practice. But if you really are that specialized, you probably can have, we'll call it 1 or 2 products, right? If you have, a couple different specializations, there's no reason why you can't also try to explain, if for someone suffering eating disorders, this is what the process tends to look like, right? We start here, then we kind of move here, and then usually we end up here. If someone contacts your practice and they're interested on the anxiety side, for example, they're really struggling with anxiety and work-life balance or something like that, you can still have a different product, so to speak, right? You're one person, but you have observed patterns within your specializations. And so you can say that the process people tend to go through when it relates to therapy to relieve anxiety tends to look like this. It starts here, then we usually end up around here, and then eventually we hope to get here. And so, if you're very, very general, I would say just to keep your conversations clear, think about the philosophy undergirding your practice, extrapolate from there. If you actually are specialized, but you offer multiple specializations, you can actually have more than one product, we'll call it. And if in fact you are completely specialized, well, then this is absolutely something you should do. Because it's going to clarify everything, all of your conversations, all of your marketing, and literally everything about your practice will be so much clearer because you are able to say, this is what I do, this is what it's like, this is how you do it. And so, just think about that depending on the nature of your practice. You're going to, create your own, product, if you will, a little bit differently. Now, one last thought for you. You want to create this always thinking about your client. And what I'm trying to get at here is you're phrasing your process with self-talk in mind. What are the words echoing in your client's head that they can relate to so that you can describe your process in a way someone can identify with? And so let me put this in black and white terms. If your process is highly clinical, if it sounds very clinical, then that's not where you want to be. If it sounds like you're talking about the process someone can see themselves transitioning through to eventually get to where they want to go, even though that your education and your clinical know-how is going to influence that, that's where you want to be. You want to be in line with the self-talk of your client. And as you know, we do a lot with authentic messaging. And so you do want to be thinking about the self-talk of your client because those are going to be the phrases that are echoing in their own heads when they're experiencing their own frustrations and they're thinking about their own hopes and dreams. And to give that even more definition, when you ask yourself those 3 different questions around the first part, the middle part, and sort of the last part of the therapeutic process that I mentioned earlier, you're asking those questions to yourself while also keeping in mind your ideal client, right? Or a client, or a very common client your practice sees if you're not really sure who your ideal client is, because that's going to help you find this phrasing. That's how you're going to know that it's right. A common question that I get is, Josh, look at this. Like, is this right? I mean, is this how I described it, but is it right? Well, I can't tell you that. What I can tell you is, do you feel like this matches the self-talk that you hear from actual people in practice? If the answer is that yes, they would really identify with the way that I've described this, well then, good job. if they would not identify with that, well, then tweak it some more until you feel like, generally speaking, this would be identified by your most common type of client. Now, that's basically it here. I hope it made sense how to productize your service so that you can help more people. If you have any questions about it, leave comments down below. I'll answer every single one. If you want me to elaborate on anything or you want to talk about this for your own practice directly, email me at josh@mindset.market. And that's it. So I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you next time.